Welcome to the Terror Time.
The first story is about the disappearing trail. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I had planned everything: maps, gear, snacks, and I'd chosen a trail I'd walked many times before. But something felt off that day. The air was heavier, the forest darker than usual. Even as I set out, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that something creepy lurked just beyond the trees, watching my every move. About an hour into the hike, I came to a fork in the trail. That's when I noticed something strange. The path I usually took seemed narrower, overgrown, like it hadn't been walked in years. Confused, I checked my map again, but it showed I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I figured the forest had just changed over time, and I pressed on. But as I moved deeper into the woods, the familiar sights and sounds of the trail faded. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, even the breeze, it all disappeared. The silence was suffocating. Every step felt heavier, like the ground was pulling me down. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic began to set in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I wandered aimlessly, calling out for help. But there was no one around. The woods seemed endless, twisting in on themselves, and every turn brought me further away from anything familiar. That's when I saw it. A house, old and decrepit, standing in a clearing where no house should have been. Its windows were dark, the door slightly ajar as if inviting me in. I knew better than to approach, but some force I couldn't explain, pulled me toward it. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing at the doorstep. I hesitated for a moment, but the silence was too overwhelming, the weight of the forest too much to bear. I stepped inside. The interior was as dilapidated as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But the strangest thing was the absence of sound. No wind, no creaks, nothing but the beating of my own heart. As I wandered through the house, I found room after room, all empty except for one. At the very back of the house there was a single door. It stood out from the rest, newer, almost untouched by time. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a small room, empty except for a mirror hanging on the wall. As I stepped closer, my reflection flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something else. Someone else. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My pulse quickened, and I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was then I realized I wasn't alone in the house. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the floor above me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The footsteps grew louder, and then I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words chilling me to the bone. I backed away, desperate to find the door, but the house seemed to shift around me. Hallways stretched on endlessly, and the door I had come through was gone. I ran, blindly searching for a way out, but the footsteps followed me, getting closer with every turn. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst into a room I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a figure, a ghost, its face pale and twisted, eyes dark with malice. It pointed at me, and in that moment I felt a wave of dread so powerful I could barely breathe. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice echoing in the empty room. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me. The figure moved closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. My mind raced with thoughts of paranormal encounters and haunted houses, but this was different. This wasn't just a horror story, this was real. In the corner of the room, I noticed something. There, written in blood on the wall, were the words, "The forest takes what it wants." I realized then that the house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap. A supernatural force had lured me here, and now it wouldn't let me leave. The figure came closer, its presence suffocating. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing colder. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard a loud crash. The door flew open, and the figure vanished. I bolted from the room, running as fast as I could through the shifting hallways until I finally found the front door. I stumbled outside, gasping for breath, but the forest was different. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisted like hands reaching for me. I ran, not caring which direction I was going, just desperate to escape. Eventually, I found myself back on the trail, the house nowhere in sight. I never told anyone what happened that day, but I've never gone hiking alone again. The forest may seem peaceful, but there are things out there, things that watch, things that wait, and some of them, once they find you, never let you go. The second story is about the Vanishing Ridge. It was supposed to be an easy overnight camping trip with a group of friends, but things took a turn when I found myself separated from everyone. We were deep in the mountains, far from any cell service, and as the sun began to set, the world around me grew eerily quiet. I was no stranger to hiking, but something about this trail felt wrong. The shadows seemed to move, stretching further than they should, and every rustle in the trees made my skin crawl. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd catch up to the group soon. But as night fell, the forest became a labyrinth of darkness. My flashlight's beam barely cut through the thick blackness, and the deeper I walked, the more disoriented I became. That's when I saw something. Just a glimpse, a figure moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but the way it moved, gliding between the trunks without a sound, sent chills down my spine. I called out, but there was no answer. My footsteps quickened, heart pounding as I tried to catch up with the figure, but it stayed just out of reach. Every time I thought I was close, it disappeared into the shadows, only to reappear in the distance. As the hours passed, I realized I wasn't just lost. I was being led somewhere. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't my friend. It was something else. Something supernatural. I stopped in my tracks, breathing hard, and that's when I heard it, a soft, distant whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but the words were unmistakable. "Come closer," it said, barely audible but insistent. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt frozen, trapped in some kind of waking nightmare. Then, from the darkness, a faint light appeared. It was coming from further up the ridge, near a clearing I didn't recognize. With no other choice, I followed it, hoping against hope that it was a sign of a campsite. But as I drew closer, the light revealed something else entirely. A small, haunted house, its windows dark, but the front door slightly open, beckoning me in. I should have turned around right then, but something pulled me toward the house. Every step felt heavier, the forest around me growing quieter, like it was holding its breath. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the air grew cold, unnaturally so, and I could feel eyes on me, watching from the trees. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the house was eerily preserved, as if someone had left in a hurry. Dust-covered furniture, cobwebs in every corner. And yet, the air felt thick, oppressive, like the house itself was alive. I wandered through the rooms calling out, but my voice echoed back at me. And then I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. My heart raced, but I couldn't stop myself from climbing the stairs. The higher I went, the colder it became. By the time I reached the top, I could see my breath in the air. At the end of the hallway, there was a single room with the door slightly ajar. From inside, I could hear a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. With every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single object, a large, old mirror. Its surface was dark, almost black, and as I stepped closer, I saw something move in the reflection. It wasn't me. It was the figure I had been following. It stood behind me now, watching. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My skin crawled as I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw her. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, standing in the reflection, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "You're next." I bolted from the house, crashing through the trees in a blind panic. I didn't stop running until I was far from the ridge, my legs burning and my lungs gasping for air. When I finally collapsed, I realized the figure had stopped following me. But the terror lingered. The next morning, I found the rest of the group, who had spent the night searching for me. They told me I had disappeared for hours, far longer than I thought. When I tried to explain what I'd seen, they just looked at me like I was crazy. But I know what I saw. That house, that ghost, it was real. Later, I learned that a woman had been murdered on that ridge decades ago. Her body was found in an abandoned house, just like the one I'd stumbled upon. Locals say her spirit haunts the area, luring lost hikers to their doom. Most people write it off as just another horror story, but I know better now. Whatever had led me to that house wasn't human. It was something darker, something paranormal, and I'll never set foot on that trail again. The third story is about the shadows on Devil's Peak. I had heard about Devil's Peak my whole life, stories about people going missing, strange sightings, and eerie sounds in the dead of night. Locals called it cursed, but I never believed in those scary stories until the day I hiked there myself. The hike started off like any other. The sun was high, the air crisp, and the trail was well marked. But as I reached the midway point, something changed. The wind died, and the forest became unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. That's when I saw it, just ahead, standing by the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker. But as I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't moving. It was a ghost, or at least, it looked like one. Pale, motionless, and barely visible in the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I pressed on, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the deeper I went, the heavier the air became. It felt like the forest was closing in, suffocating me. Every turn seemed wrong, like the trail itself was shifting, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. As the sun began to set, I stumbled upon a small, haunted house, hidden deep in the woods. It was old, falling apart, but there was something about it that drew me closer. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but curiosity got the better of me. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. The air inside was thick and musty, and every step I took echoed loudly in the empty rooms. I felt like I was trespassing, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps coming from upstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Who could be inside? Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, climbing the rickety staircase to the second floor. At the end of the hall, I saw a door slightly ajar. The footsteps stopped as I approached, and for a moment, everything was silent. I pushed the door open, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. Not human, something darker. Its eyes were hollow, its form shifting and unclear, like a shadow that couldn't quite take shape. A demon, I thought, but I didn't want to believe it. The room grew colder, and I could barely breathe. The figure moved toward me, slow and deliberate, as if it was studying me. My feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't run. "Leave," it whispered, its voice sending a chill down my spine. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted down the stairs and out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was far from that cursed place. As I reached the base of the trail, I glanced back at Devil's Peak. The house was gone. It was as if it had never existed. But I knew what I had seen. The paranormal force that lurked there wasn't just a story. It was real. Later, I learned about the murder that had taken place on the peak years ago. A man had disappeared, and his body was found weeks later near the same spot where I had seen the haunted house. People said his spirit roamed the mountain, luring hikers to their doom. I never went back to Devil's Peak. Some places, I realized, are better left alone. What happened to me that day wasn't just a horror story. It was a warning. The fourth story is about the Silent Watcher, a true tale of lost hikers. The first time it happened, we were about 10 miles deep into the forest, far away from any marked trails. My friends and I thought we were seasoned hikers, so this particular hike was just supposed to be an adventure, another check off our bucket list. We were wrong, terribly wrong. It was late afternoon when the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birds that had been chirping all morning vanished. The wind that rustled through the trees suddenly stopped. A chilling silence replaced the usual sounds of nature, and with it, an unsettling sense of dread crept over us. My friend Sarah stopped in her tracks and asked if we had seen the man in the distance. "What man?" I asked. She pointed toward the woods, and I strained my eyes. There he was, a figure barely visible, standing still among the trees. I figured it was another hiker, but something about him made my stomach drop. He was too still, too quiet. His clothes looked odd, almost old-fashioned. I blinked, and he was gone. We brushed it off as a trick of the light or maybe exhaustion, but the air around us felt different, heavier, like something was watching us, waiting. As we pressed on, strange things started to happen. My watch, my reliable GPS, and even my phone, all dead, and the sun was setting. That's when I started hearing whispers, faint and fleeting, as if carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was Sarah or Mike, but both of them swore they heard it too. Only it wasn't from either of us. The whispers were unintelligible, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of terror. It felt like a paranormal activity was happening around us. We tried to turn back, but the trail seemed different, twisted, unfamiliar. Every path we took led us deeper into the woods. The trees began to look the same, and every step made it feel like we were walking in circles. That's when Sarah saw the man again. This time, he was much closer. His face, if you could even call it that, was a blur, shifting like a bad memory. The temperature dropped suddenly and a thick fog began rolling in. Sarah screamed. She claimed she saw something move behind the man, something dark and massive. We all felt it, an evil presence that made our hair stand on end. We ran, but no matter how fast or far we went, it was as if we were being pulled back, like the forest had become a living, breathing trap. It wasn't until we stumbled upon the remains of an old haunted cabin that things got worse. The cabin looked abandoned for decades, rotting and covered in vines, but the door creaked open as if someone or something was inviting us in. We should have turned back, but we were desperate, lost, and terrified. Inside, it was cold. Freezing cold. There were old furniture pieces covered in dust, but one thing stood out, a mirror hanging on the far wall. As I approached it, my reflection wasn't right. My eyes looked hollow, lifeless, and behind me I saw him, the man from the woods. This time he wasn't alone. Shadows moved with him, twisting and swirling like a storm of spirits. My heart pounded as I turned around, but nothing was there. The creepy whispers were louder now, filling the room, and Sarah started crying, saying something had touched her. Mike was frozen, staring at the mirror like he was in a trance. It was then I realized, this wasn't just a hike gone wrong. This place was a real ghost trap, an ancient site of unsolved mysteries, pulling people in and never letting them leave. In the corner of my eye, I noticed a dusty old camera on the shelf. Out of curiosity, I picked it up and powered it on. The last video was taken right outside the cabin, blurry but unmistakable. The same man standing in the woods, staring into the lens. We had stumbled into something that wasn't supposed to be caught on camera. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and everything went black. When I woke up, it was daylight, and I was lying on the forest floor. Sarah and Mike were gone. The cabin was gone. There was no sign we had ever been there, except for one thing. My watch was working again, but the time was off by exactly 24 hours. What had happened in that missing day? I'll never know,